Thank you for listening to Light of the Vedas. This is your host, Sri Sachinandana Das. In our previous episode, we discussed how Vyasadeva had written down the Bhagavat Purana, or the Srimad Bhagavatam, which is the essence of the Vedas, the Sarve Vedetihasanam Saram Saram, which means the cream of the Vedas and the Itihasas. It's really the essence of the Vedas, just as a dairy producer will extract cream from milk. By churning milk, you bring out the thickest and the sweetest and the fattest part of the substance, and this becomes the sar, or the cream. If you look at those old milk jugs that the milkman used to deliver at the door, these kind of like glass pitchers, you'll see there's kind of like a bubble on top, and that bubble's for the cream. After they fill it with milk, they would usually spit some cream down into that little bubble. And so it tastes very sweet. It's the most delicious part of the milk. And it's the very essence of the milk. And so the Bhagavat Purana is described as the very essence of the Vedas, the essence of Vedic knowledge, and especially the spiritual knowledge within the Vedas. And it consists of the sort of record of the avatars of Vishnu or Krishna within the universe. Every time the one transcendent God or deity who exists beyond matter, from whom everything emanates and by whom everything is maintained and into whom everything is destroyed, that supreme absolute truth in the form of a person, then he descends within this world again and again and again in order to uplift the souls within the universe who are sort of lost within Maya or illusion. And the way he does this is by sort of sharing his personality, sharing his name, sharing what he looks like, his form, sharing the various qualities of his personality, who he is, sort of like introducing himself as a person. Hi, here, I'm God, how you doing? Right? Like in a very personal way, sort of reaching into human society and showing himself. And also performing many wonderful pastimes, many miraculous activities. And so within the Vedic literature, or the Vedic society, there's a certain religious practice or yoga practice, which is known as Bhagavat Dharma, which is where saintly people come together and they sit together and they hear and they chant. They discuss the topics of these incarnations or avatars. Bodhayanta parasparam, like they basically discuss with each other. And because these incarnations are transcendental, by hearing about them, then one becomes extremely purified. And after becoming purified, one reaches such a high level of transcendental realization that you experience transcendental bliss or ecstasy. And then feeling that and being enlivened by that transcendental pleasure, even the hairs on one's body will stand on end, tears will flow from the eyes, one will become thrilled at every moment. And the more purified one becomes, these topics of the Bhagavat, they will then become sweeter and sweeter and sweeter. And so this spiritual practice, then Vyasadeva sort of wrote down all the topics that these individuals discuss amongst each other. And this becomes the Bhagavat Purana. And it's just many wonderful stories and amazing happenings within the history of the universe, of the avatars of Vishnu, as well as the activities of the devotees of Vishnu. And it's very purifying and very sweet to hear. And it's also the very essence of the Vedas and Vedic knowledge. So Vyasadeva, as mentioned, he gave this important literature to his own son, Sukadev Goswami. And Sukadev Goswami is not only his son, he's also his disciple. And there's many wonderful stories about this individual. He was, according to the Brahma Vaivarta Purana, he wasn't born immediately. He was actually, within his womb as a baby, he was enlightened. He was already an enlightened being. He already had consciousness which existed beyond matter. And he was afraid to be born. He didn't want to be born because he felt like if I'm born into this world, I'll become surrounded by illusion. I'll lose my spiritual consciousness and be drawn to the illusion of the world. And you'll see, like when a baby's born, the parents will lean over the baby and talk to it, and in many ways, like our personality is formed at that time, or that idea of various ideas of who we are, what our position is in the world. It's impressed upon us as we're a baby. And the activities of the parents, the consciousness of the parents, how the parents interact with the child. Are they loving and kind? Are they cruel and heartless? These things all shape our personality. And so he didn't want to be subjected to that. He wanted to remain within pure spiritual consciousness. And so he refused to come out. And then Vishnu came to him in the womb and said, look, you have to take birth. And he sort of made a deal, Sukadeva Goswami was saying, well, look, I'll only come out if you give me the blessing that I won't fall into illusion. And so he did. Eventually he was born after, some time being in the womb, a long time. And when he was born, he immediately grew into, like a teenage body. Like his body grew far quicker than an ordinary child. And he was filled with complete transcendental knowledge. And for this reason, he was totally detached from the world. He cared nothing for family life or for, the normal things that children are interested in. In fact, he was so detached that he immediately just left his family behind. He sort of just, as a young child or a young boy, he just walked right into the forest and left aside his family, basically taking sannyas, renouncing the whole material world and entering into the spiritual order of life. And even though his father was Vyasadeva, this great sage, and the compiler of the Vedas, this sort of wellspring of knowledge, he didn't even care. He just sort of walked into the forest to go practice meditation. In fact, it describes that his father was following behind him and actually calling out to him, Sukadev, Sukadev, where are you? Come back, come back. Shuka. And Shuka means parrot in Sanskrit. And so he's calling out, Shuka, Shuka, Shuka. And it mentions that only the trees answered, meaning that his voice was just echoing off the trees. And Shuka had left without looking back, right? And there's another story regarding Vyas, the father, chasing after Shuka, is that he was, following him through the forest, and then he came across a sort of like a lake filled with young women who were bathing naked. And traditionally, you'll see in India and other places as well, people would bathe in the rivers and lakes, and some places were set aside just for women, no men allowed. And then the women would bathe there. And so Vyasadeva was running by, and he was actually following behind Shuka. And so Shuka walked by the girls first, and they didn't even look at him. And he was a young, probably around 16-year-old boy, and he would walk completely naked, because he was so detached from reality that he wasn't even conscious of his material surroundings. Like he was just fully absorbed in transcendence, in Brahman, to such an extent that he didn't bother with anything material at all. And he didn't even bother clothing himself. He's just like a naked yogi. And so he, as a young 16-year-old boy, he just kind of walks by all these girls in the lake. And they would just, normally if a man walks by, they'll rush and try to put on their clothes and stuff like that. But when he walked by, they didn't even pay attention. And Vyasadeva was watching this from afar and was shocked, because usually, like 16-year-old boy walks by some naked women, he's going to be attracted, and they're going to, it's going to be a situation, right? But they just treated him like, he wasn't even there. And then when Vyasadeva started to come walking by, then they heard him, come up the path, and they immediately grabbed all their clothes and put it on and covered themselves, and like, what are you doing here, right? And so Vyasadeva was shocked, and he asked them, hey, how come you're covering yourself for me, but you didn't for my son? I'm a great sage, what is this? And they said, well, we can tell by his consciousness that he didn't even look at us as women. He wasn't attracted to us, certainly, but he didn't even see us as our bodies. We could see that there was no lust in his heart. He saw us just as Brahman, just as transcendental energy, basically. And he saw us as souls, and he wasn't looking at our bodies. And therefore, we didn't feel a need to cover up. It's like he's so spiritually advanced and pure and free from any personal selfish desire or illusion that they just felt, they didn't feel any kind of sexual energy or bodily energy at all. Whereas when Vyasadeva walked by, he's a householder. He's a guy with a wife and children and family and everything. And so he's dealing on the bodily platform. And so therefore they felt that it was necessary to cover themselves. And so this, as we mentioned, he's kind of Shuka was so detached from material reality that he wouldn't really even pay attention to anything. He didn't interact with the world on the mundane platform. And so many people thought of him as being crazy or just completely ignorant or mentally handicapped. A young 16-year-old boy, and he's described as being very beautiful, physically extremely beautiful. And yet he's walking totally naked. And he would just sort of walk around through the forests and villages, absorbed in Brahman, absorbed in meditation, and yet average people thought him to be crazy, and they couldn't recognize, the sort of the greatness of his consciousness, and he would, he would beg food at people's houses. You might hear Bhavati Bhuksham Dehi, or some sort of prayer announcing his presence at your door. And then you'd come out and you'd see this beautiful young boy, completely naked and begging just for some milk. And describes that he only stayed long enough to take the milk. Like he was so detached and sort of averse in many ways towards material entanglement that he wouldn't even stay at the door of your average person for very long, just however long it took to get him something, right? And then he would leave. And even that, his consciousness wasn't there like he's greedy or he wants something from them. He was there just to kind of sanctify them with his presence. It's kind of like out of compassion or kindness. If he gives them the opportunity to associate with him, then they become purified. And it's the case, he's like a great saint. And so you would see this naked young boy and you're kind of thinking, what is this? Is it crazy? Or, what's going on with this guy? And then you give him some milk and, maybe some rice or something. And then as he walks away, you feel like your whole consciousness going, like raising up, and you feel yourself totally purified, and even having spiritual realization just because you touched him or just because you saw him, right? And so this is an incredibly powerful personality. And so he was walking through the forest one day. He was actually walking through the different places of India, in northern India, sort of walking around naked like a madman like this. And then there was a bunch of people would follow him, like young boys and girls, like children, as well as just sort of young girls from the village. They would be walking behind him and calling him names or teasing him and, look at the crazy guy, look at him walking naked, and sort of following behind him. And then there's a scene within the Bhagavat Purana where they're following like this, and all of a sudden he enters into a clearing, and there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sages all sitting down, and the Emperor of the world is sitting there as well. And just when he enters into their presence, they all stand up out of respect. They can see his physical, for who he is, and they can see his physiognomy, like the characteristics of his physical form, and can see that he's a great personality, and they can recognize that his consciousness is completely transcendental. And so these great sages and rishis all stand out of respect. And there also is his father, as well as Narada Muni, sort of the guru of his father. And immediately, these children and these girls and stuff, they're like, oh my gosh, what is this? And they just sort of turn around and run away, So this person they thought was mad is actually this incredibly powerful and respected sage, even though he's just a young boy. And so he enters into this assembly, and it's interesting because at the assembly, this Emperor Parikshit had just finished asking a question of the sages that can one of you please describe to me the glories of Vishnu, or the what is the absolute truth? And so immediately upon asking that, the sages were sort of deciding amongst themselves who's the greatest one of us and who's actually going to sit on this asana or seat of teaching, and who's going to instruct this emperor in the absolute truth. And this is a very strange situation because the emperor, he's not just there to hear from these sages, he's actually there to die. He had been cursed by a Brahmin sage, a young boy named Shringi, and so he only had 7 days to live. And he decided to leave aside all of his kingdom and responsibilities and come to the bank of the Ganges where this was happening. And then at the bank of the Ganges, he would sit and hear from these sages for the final 7 days of his life, and hopefully to become purified and immersed completely in transcendence. And at the time of death, he would attain the ultimate or supreme destination, become enlightened, and then become liberated from samsara, or the cycle of birth and death. And so he sat with all these sages essentially to die. And they were all discussing who's going to be the one to speak to the emperor, who's going to be the one to sort of give him this spiritual guidance and elevate his consciousness, which one of us is most qualified. And then immediately Sukadeva Goswami entered into the assembly of the sages, and by divine arrangement. And they all recognized who he was and stood, and then they invited him to sit upon the seat before the king and to instruct the king. And so the majority of the Bhagavat Purana, it's the discussion between Sukadeva Goswami and this emperor. And the emperor's name is King Parikshit. So in the next episode, we're going to discuss a little bit about King Parikshit and why he's there at the bank of the Ganges preparing to die. So thank you very much for listening. If you found value in this, please like and subscribe. If you're listening on iTunes, please visit srisachinandana.com/iTunes and leave a positive review. Thank you again, and we hope you'll join us next time on Light of the Vedas.